Before I tell you what country we will be visiting today and what year we will be going to, I first want to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Hard Rock Neverland Casino. If you are looking for an exciting way to add some thrill to your day, let me introduce you to Hard Rock Neverland Casino, the ultimate casino experience right on your phone. But the best part, it's completely free to download and play. This app has over 100 unique slot games, including some that are inspired by Hard Rock's iconic memorabilia, which are perfect for history and music lovers. You'll also find hits like Pirate's Fortune, Golden Buffalo, and Wild Spins. The smooth gameplay and stunning visuals make it an experience you won't want to put down. And here's a pro tip: log in daily to grab free spins, coins, and bonuses to keep the fun going. One event you won't want to miss is Hard Rock Neverland Casino's $1 million cash giveaway. Every spin wins, and prizes include thousands in cash, exclusive Hard Rock merchandise, and even free stays. Plus, they're giving you a 2 million coin bonus just for signing up. Imagine spinning your favourite slots and walking away with unforgettable rewards. It's a chance you don't want to miss. So what are you waiting for? Tap the link in the description or the pinned comments to download Hard Rock Neverland Casino, spin the reels, and join the $1 million giveaway today. Now let's go to England in the second part of the 19th century. Harriet Richardson was born in 1841 in the county of Essex in England. Her father, a devoted clergyman, instilled in her the values of faith and obedience, but his untimely death when Harriet was just 12 years old left a void in her life, one that no sermon or scripture could ever fill. With his passing, the family's modest stability began to unravel, and Harriet, a girl of fragile intellect and an innocent disposition, became increasingly dependent upon those around her. Though life had not granted Harriet with wit or learning, fate had bestowed on her a modest fortune. When her great-aunt passed away, she had inherited £5,000, a substantial sum in Victorian England, enough to make her an attractive prospect for unscrupulous suitors. It was around this time that Louis Staunton entered her life, a young man of 23 who worked as an auctioneer's clerk and whose charm masked a calculating nature. He had already entangled himself with a 15-year-old girl named Alice Rhodes, a relationship that in the eyes of polite society would have been scandalous if publicly known. Alice had a stepfather, a man named Thomas Hinksman, who was distantly related to the Richardson family. In 1875, through this tenuous connection, Louis was unexpectedly introduced to Harriet. The meeting was not planned, but Louis, with his easy manner, quickly made an impression. Sensing that Harriet was a woman of wealth, yet perhaps of limited mental capacity, he wasted little time in courting her, seemingly determined to secure her affections and the advantages that might come with them. The romance was brief, and soon after meeting, Louis proposed to Harriet. To many who observed this rapid courtship, it was deeply troubling. Harriet's mother, now Mrs. Butterfield, after remarrying, was vehemently opposed to the engagement. She saw Louis as an opportunist, preying on her daughter's vulnerability and inheritance. Desperate to protect Harriet, Mrs. Butterfield sought to have her declared legally incompetent and placed under the protection of the Court of Chancery. This led to legal proceedings, in which Harriet's family argued that her condition was so severe that she should be prevented from marrying, claiming that she was too weak-minded to make such a decision on her own. The case was brought before the Lord Chancellor, who heard medical testimony from both sides. After careful consideration, the court ruled that the wedding could proceed. On the 16th of June 1875, Harriet and Louis were married. Yet marriage did not bring happiness. The legal battle had only deepened the rift between Harriet's husband and her family, and although she remained in contact with them for the first few months, communication soon ceased. Her mother and her stepfather made repeated efforts to learn of her well-being, but their inquiries were met with silence. Eventually a letter, supposedly from Harriet, arrived, informing her mother, Mrs. Butterfield, that she was not welcome at her marital home. The letter was written in a very firm manner, and the words were cold and forceful, making Mrs. Butterfield think that this was entirely out of character for her daughter. She believed that the letter had been dictated by Louis. Almost immediately after she was married, Harriet had become pregnant, and on the 23rd of March 1876, she gave birth to a son, who the couple named Thomas Henry. The joy of the new arrival, however, was short-lived, as instead of it being a time of celebration, it was overshadowed by the changes that followed. Louis purchased a house called Little Grays near the village of Cudham in Kent, but rather than establishing a family home with his wife and child, he chose to live there with Alice Rhodes. Harriet and her infant son were sent to live a mile away in Firth Cottage, under the cruel and watchful eye of Louis's younger brother Patrick and his wife Elizabeth, who was Alice Rhodes' elder sister. Harriet and Thomas were confined to the small upstairs room and deprived of even the most basic comforts. There were no curtains to shield them from the elements, no washing facilities, and no proper furniture. Harriet, already vulnerable and inexperienced in the harsh realities of the world, was intimidated into silent obedience. Meanwhile, Mrs. Butterfield's instincts were warning her with an unshakable certainty that her daughter was in grave danger. By now, Harriet's will was as frail as her body. Her world had shrunk to that miserable upstairs room. The ceaseless cries of her hungry child, and the suffocating presence of those who sought only to control and harm her. In March 1877, desperate to see her daughter, Mrs. Butterfield attempted to visit. She travelled by train to Howstead Station and was taken in a horse and carriage by George Wells to Firth Cottage. However, as she was walking up the path, Louis Staunton and his sister-in-law Elizabeth met her before she could knock on the door and barred her from going any further. Mrs. Butterfield pleaded with them to let her see her daughter, or at least hear her voice, but the request was refused, and she was forcefully turned away and told never to return. Things for Harriet and her baby did not improve, and by early 1877, Thomas had grown gravely ill. His tiny body, deprived of proper nourishment, was wasting away, each day bringing him closer to death. His sunken eyes and fragile limbs bore the unmistakable signs of starvation, but there were other, more sinister marks as well. A deep bruise on his cheek suggested physical abuse, proof of the cruelty he had endured in his short, tragic life. On the 8th of April, Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton finally took him to Guy's Hospital in London, but it was far too late. The child died that very day, his body too weak to fight any longer. His suffering was over, but for his mother, the nightmare continued. 4 days later, Harriet was removed from Firth Cottage and taken to a lodging house at 34 Forbes Road in Penge, a place that was meant to be a refuge, but when she arrived, the landlady recoiled in horror. Harriet was more shadow than woman, someone seemingly clinging to the last threads of life. Her body was skeletal, her skin pale and stretched over sharp bones, her eyes vacant and lifeless. It was clear to anyone who saw her that she had endured unimaginable torment, and less than 24 hours later, she died. She had succumbed to the abuse, to the starvation, to the unbearable cruelty that had defined her final months. Following the death of his wife, Louis Staunton arranged for the body to be buried at the St. George's Church in Beckenham in Kent. He believed her death would go unquestioned. She had been ill, frail, and isolated, and her decline, though tragic, to him seemed quite natural. There was no reason for anyone to suspect that something more sinister had taken place, but as is often the case in such matters, whispers of doubt began to spread. Those who had seen Harriet before she had died had noted her skeletal frame and the way she seemed more ghost than woman. They were unable to reconcile her condition as a death attributed to natural causes, and rumours of mistreatment began to circulate, raising questions about the circumstances of her final days. A gentleman told the police that he had bumped into Mr. Louis Staunton while he was inquiring about the process for recording his wife's death. He said that although this encounter was brief, there was something about Mr. Staunton's manner that unsettled him. The gentleman claimed that he was speaking with detachment, something that seemed odd for a man who had so recently lost his wife and son. Following this, and after speaking with hospital staff and others familiar with the Stauntons, the coroner grew increasingly uneasy about the true cause of Harriet's death. Concerned that something had been overlooked, he took the decisive step in halting the funeral to allow for a post-mortem examination to be conducted. When the pathologist opened the coffin, those present were met with a harrowing sight. Any doubts about the nature of her death quickly faded. Harriet's hair was matted and infested with lice, clear evidence of the neglect that she had endured. Her heart and liver were also very much smaller from that of a healthy 36-year-old female. The initial cause of death was dismissed and replaced with a far more chilling verdict: starvation and neglect. At the time of her death, she weighed just 5 stone and 4 pounds, or 34 kilos. Her body wasted away from prolonged mistreatment. An inquest was arranged to be held at the Park Tavern public house. Here, Mr. Staunton told the coroner that before his wife died, she had become increasingly dependent on alcohol and had developed a troubling habit of refusing to eat. He described how her health had deteriorated over time, her body weakening and her appetite all but vanishing. The pathologist's evidence, however, revealed a different story. Despite Mr. Staunton's claims, no traces of excessive alcohol were found, but there was a deep redness in her tissues, suggesting the presence of irritant poisoning. The pathologist had expected to find a toxin, but could identify no natural explanation for the strange discoloration. In his view, the immediate cause of death was starvation. Moving her frail body would have caused a fatal shock to her system. When pressed further, the doctor confirmed that her conditions seemed more consistent with poisoning than natural causes. He said that any poison would likely have been administered gradually rather than in a sudden dose. He added that Harriet appeared weak, as if her life had been draining from her for some time. Other witnesses confirmed her extreme frailty. Railway station workers testified that she was not strong enough to even step on the carriage without help when travelling to hospital. When it was the defence counsel's turn to speak, the lawyer, Mr. Douglas Straits, announced that he would not be calling any witnesses. The room fell into a heavy silence. There would be no argument, no defence, only the grim, inescapable truth. By the time the inquest ended, the jury believed that Louis Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton, along with Alice Rhodes, were guilty of murdering Harriet Staunton, and they were remanded in custody to await their trial. While in prison, both Elizabeth and Alice gave birth. The trial began on Wednesday the 19th of September 1877 at the Old Bailey, and presiding over the proceedings was Judge Henry Hawkins, known for his sharp wit and unyielding manner. The trial was a spectacle, drawing crowds from all corners of London. Fashionable ladies draped in their finest silks and furs arrived not to mourn the tragic fate of Harriet Staunton, but to look at the accused. They peered through opera glasses, their expressions shifting between fascination and revulsion, as if they were spectators at the theatre rather than witnessing a murder trial. Many witnesses who gave evidence at the inquest also gave evidence at the trial, and the prosecution painted a grim picture of Harriet's final months. The isolation, the starvation, and the violence that she endured at the hands of those meant to care for her. But the defence, led by the formidable barrister Edward Clarke, fought to shift the argument, claiming that the death of Harriet Staunton was not the result of a calculated scheme or intentional deprivation of food. Instead, they contended that her passing was due to a medical condition that had caused her body to gradually waste away. The defence emphasised that her extreme weight loss was a symptom of the illness rather than evidence of mistreatment or neglect, and sought to persuade the jury that there was no malicious intent involved in her decline. Edward Clarke stood up and said that the deteriorating health of the deceased had a natural cause beyond the control of the accused. A key witness was Miss Clara Brown, a cousin of the two female defendants, who gave testimony for more than 6 hours. Having lived at the house, she provided a detailed account of the living conditions. She stated that Harriet had often complained about not receiving enough food and had appeared to grow weak over time. She also said that although there was a fireplace in the deceased's bedroom, she only remembered one fire being lit between Christmas and April before the poor lady passed away. Mary Ann Weatherly was another witness. She told the court that she lived in Knockholt and that her father was a coal dealer. She said that she knew the house where Patrick and Elizabeth Staunton lived and had often delivered butter there. She said that on Christmas Day, she went there with a girl named Miss Mary Ann Longridge and found that Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Staunton were away. She said that she was greeted by Miss Clara Brown, who led her into the kitchen, but then, suddenly she heard footsteps, and Miss Clara immediately went to the kitchen door and shut it, and called out, "Go back, ma'am." Miss Weatherly said that she had not been aware that another lady was living in the house with a child. This statement was confirmed by Mary Ann Longridge, the girl who had been with Miss Weatherly. Mrs. Elizabeth Staunton was deeply troubled by the accusations that both she and her husband faced. She attributed their predicament to weakness in their own actions, but she firmly stated to the court that she had never intentionally kept Harriet Staunton without food. She said that Harriet had free access to the house and could help herself to anything in the cupboards, especially when she and her husband were away. She denied ever instructing Clara Brown to refuse food to the deceased or control her movements inside the house. Mr. G, who was representing Alice Rhodes, insisted that his client had never exhibited any cruelty or neglect towards Harriet Staunton. In fact, he argued that Alice had consistently shown kindness and concern for the deceased and had played no role in any alleged wrongdoing and should therefore not be implicated in the tragic outcome. He urged the jury to recognise that her actions were not those of someone complicit to harm, but rather of a person who had treated Miss Harriet Staunton with care and compassion. But the jury were not convinced. After deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. All 4 defendants were then sentenced to death by hanging. The decision settled heavily over the courtroom. Patrick Staunton seemed quite shaken, while his brother Louis sat completely still, his face blank, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if struggling to comprehend what had just been said. Outside the courtroom, a dense fog surrounded the crowd, but the cold did little to deter them. When the news of the verdict reached their ears, an eruption of cheers filled the air. They believed that justice had been served. Judge Hawkins, in his final remarks, did nothing to temper the outrage. He declared the crime to be one of the most hideous on record, condemning the barbarity and incredible cruelty that had led to Harriet's suffering and her death. Yet as the public celebrated, not everyone accepted the verdict. A letter soon appeared in the medical journal The Lancet, signed by 700 physicians, decrying how the court had disregarded expert medical testimony. There were also murmurs of judicial bias, with many believing that the judge had steered the trial against the accused from the outset. The case caught the attention of the celebrated novelist Charles Reade, who led a campaign to get the decision overturned. When Elizabeth Staunton was interviewed in prison, she acknowledged that the defence counsel had done their best during the trial, but thought that they had not been adequately prepared. She felt that if they had been able to ask Clara Brown a few pointed questions, it would have entirely changed the course of the case. Mrs. Staunton didn't believe that Clara was a bad person, but suspected that she had been influenced by Mrs. Butterfield and may have been offered a better position or some other incentive to answer questions in court the way she did. Mrs. Staunton expressed no great fondness for Mrs. Butterfield, but denied the harsh comments attributed to her and Louis Staunton by the cabman who took Mrs. Butterfield to the house in March 1877. She said that they would have allowed the lady to see Harriet if she hadn't been so violent and abusive towards them. She added that after Mrs. Butterfield left, she told her husband that it might have been better if they had let her see her daughter. When asked to explain why she hadn't sent for a doctor when she realised Harriet was ill, Mrs. Staunton explained that at first she didn't believe that the illness was serious. She then said in a somewhat regretful manner that they didn't want to call the local doctor because it would reveal that her sister Alice Rhodes, who was living at Little Grays, was not in fact Louis's wife, and of course they did not want this known in the neighbourhood. Mrs. Staunton stated that in the last 3 or 4 days of Harriet's life, they'd tried to feed her beef tea, gruel, or anything that was easy to swallow. She said that they did everything they could for her, but did admit that in the past, she had been indifferent towards the deceased's comfort and health, but said that she had no ill intent toward her. She went on to say that she found it ridiculous that people would think that they would have treated Harriet in that way, especially considering they gave her freedom to move about the house. Eventually, the Home Secretary intervened. Alice Rhodes was pardoned and released, and the sentences of the remaining 3 were commuted to life imprisonment. The outcome, however, was far from merciful. Patrick Staunton did not live to see the outside of a prison cell again and died behind bars. His wife Elizabeth fared better. She was released in 1883 and then faded into obscurity. Louis Staunton, the man at the centre of it all, remained in prison until 1897. However, upon his release, he never admitted guilt, and wanting to seek a fresh start, far from the shadow of his past, he left England behind and emigrated to Australia. Although some believe that the Stauntons were innocent victims of a grave miscarriage of justice, others see their actions as calculated cruelty. Whatever the truth behind the deaths of Harriet and her baby Thomas Henry, Patrick, Louis and Elizabeth Staunton, along with Alice Rhodes, will be names forever linked to one of the most shocking cases of neglect and mistreatment Victorian England ever witnessed. I'd once again like to thank Hard Rock Neverland Casino for sponsoring today's video, and to download the app, just click on the link in the description. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case